The harsh wind whipped across the platform of Shoshone City's train station, carrying dust and the scent of sage through the crisp Wyoming air. Lena Blackburn clutched her threadbare shawl tighter around her bony shoulders, her eyes scanning the crowd for the man whose letters had promised her a new life. October 1876 had brought an early chill to the frontier town, and Lena's thin cotton dress offered little protection against the elements, just as it failed to conceal how severely the last 2 years had diminished her once healthy frame. Lena had traveled for 6 days from Cincinnati, each mile taking her farther from the memories of illness, debt, and the empty chairs around her family's table. The journey had depleted what little strength she had left, along with the meager provisions she'd packed for the trip. Her stomach twisted with hunger and anxiety as she stood alone on the platform, her single carpetbag containing everything she owned in the world. "Miss Blackburn?" A deep voice called from behind her. Lena turned, her heart pounding against her ribs. The man before her stood several inches taller than she remembered from the small tintype he'd sent with his proposal. His broad shoulders were draped in a worn leather coat, and his sun-weathered face was partially obscured by a neatly trimmed beard. His eyes, however, were exactly as she'd imagined, clear blue and direct, with a quiet intensity that made her breath catch. "Mr. Nathans?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the hissing steam of the departing train. Frederick Nathans removed his hat, revealing thick brown hair in need of a trim. "Yes, madam, Frederick Nathans." He extended a calloused hand, then seemed to think better of it and awkwardly dropped it to his side. "I trust your journey wasn't too difficult." Before Lena could answer, a wave of dizziness washed over her. The platform tilted beneath her feet, and she reached blindly for something to steady herself. Frederick moved with surprising swiftness, his strong arms catching her before she crumpled to the wooden planks. "Miss Blackburn." Alarm colored his voice as he supported her weight. "Are you all right?" Lena tried to nod, mortified by her weakness, but the world continued to spin. Frederick's face swam before her eyes, and she was dimly aware of him lifting her carpetbag with one hand while keeping the other firmly around her waist. "When did you last eat something?" he asked, his voice low and urgent as he guided her toward a waiting wagon. "Yesterday morning," she admitted, shame burning her cheeks. I ran out of provisions." Frederick's expression darkened as he helped her onto the wagon seat. He climbed up beside her and reached behind to pull a canteen and a cloth-wrapped package from under the seat. "Here," he said, unwrapping a thick slice of bread with a generous wedge of cheese. "It's not much, but it'll help until we get home." Lena's fingers trembled as she accepted the food. Despite her desperate hunger, she forced herself to take small bites, knowing that eating too quickly after such deprivation would only make her ill. Frederick watched her for a moment, his brow furrowed with concern, before turning his attention to the horses. As the wagon pulled away from the station, Lena stole a glance at the man who was now, for all intents and purposes, her betrothed. He wasn't what she'd expected. His letters had been practical and straightforward, a man of 32 seeking a wife to share his life and help maintain his ranch 12 miles outside of Shoshone City. He'd been candid about the hardships of frontier life, but had promised steady provision and respect. Nothing in those carefully penned pages had prepared her for the gentleness in his hands, or the worry that had flashed across his face when she'd nearly fainted. "Miss Blackburn," Frederick said, breaking the silence as they passed the last buildings of Shoshone City, "I can see you've fallen on hard times." Lena swallowed, tasting humiliation along with the bread. "My father died of consumption 2 years ago. My mother followed 6 months later. The medical bills took everything we had." She stopped, unwilling to recount how she'd slowly sold every possession, worked her fingers raw as a seamstress, and still watched her younger siblings go hungry until her aunt in Baltimore had grudgingly taken them in. "I understand hardship," Frederick said quietly, "and I want to be clear about something right now." He turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "You'll never go hungry again, not while you're under my care." The simple declaration, spoken without flourish or sentimentality, brought unexpected tears to Lena's eyes. She looked away, focusing on the vast landscape stretching before them, rolling hills dotted with sagebrush and the distant silhouette of mountains. It was a foreign world to a city-raised woman, but in that moment, it held more promise than anything she'd left behind. "Thank you," she whispered. They rode in companionable silence for nearly an hour, the rhythmic clip-clop of the horses' hooves and the creaking of the wagon wheels providing a steady backdrop to Lena's racing thoughts. The food had restored some of her strength, and she found herself studying her surroundings with growing interest. "That's Johnson Creek," Frederick said, pointing to a ribbon of water winding through the valley below. "It runs through the north corner of my property." "Good water even in drought years." "How large is your ranch?" Lena asked, realizing how little she actually knew about her future home. 300 acres, though only about 50 are suitable for crops. The rest is grazing land for the cattle. Pride colored his voice. "My father started with just 20 acres back in '52, built it up bit by bit. Your parents, are they?" "Gone," Frederick confirmed. "Pa 5 years ago, Ma last spring, it's just me now." He paused. "And you, if you still want to go through with this arrangement." The question hung in the air between them, an acknowledgement that their correspondence, while detailed about practical matters, had left much unsaid about the personal aspects of their potential union. Lena considered her response carefully. "I came west to honor my commitment, Mr. Nathans." "I don't make promises lightly," Frederick nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer. "Nor do I, Miss Blackburn." The wagon crested a small hill and Frederick reined the horses to a stop. "There it is," he said, a hint of nervousness in his voice. "Nathan's ranch." Lena gazed down at the property spread before them. A sturdy 2-story house of rough-hewn timber stood in a clearing, smoke curling lazily from its stone chimney. A large barn and several smaller outbuildings were arranged in a rough semicircle behind it. Fields of what looked like wheat stretched to the east, while cattle grazed in the pastures to the north. It wasn't grand by any means, but it was substantial and well-maintained, the work of generations. "It's lovely," Lena said truthfully. Relief softened Frederick's features as he urged the horses forward again. "It's not what you're used to in Cincinnati, I expect." "What I was used to in Cincinnati is gone," Lena replied, surprised by her own candor. "This is my future now." They approached the house along a well-worn path, and Lena noticed a figure emerge onto the porch, an elderly woman with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore a practical dark dress and a clean white apron, her hands planted firmly on her hips as she watched the wagon approach. "That's Mrs. Holloway," Frederick explained. "She's been helping me since Ma passed. Comes up from town 3 times a week to cook and keep the house in order. I told her you were arriving today." As Frederick brought the wagon to a stop before the house, Mrs. Holloway descended the porch steps with surprising agility for a woman of her years. Her shrewd eyes took in Lena's appearance, narrowing slightly at her thin frame and pallid complexion. "So this is your bride-to-be," she said, her voice crisp but not unkind. "You look half-starved, girl. Come inside. I've got stew on the stove and fresh bread cooling." Frederick helped Lena down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Mrs. Holloway doesn't believe in wasting time on formalities," he said with a small smile. "A sensible approach," Lena replied, finding herself oddly comforted by the older woman's directness. The interior of the house was plain but comfortable, with solid furniture built for functionality rather than fashion. The main room served as both parlor and dining area, with a large hearth dominating one wall. The smell of beef stew and baking bread filled the space, making Lena's mouth water despite the food she'd eaten earlier. "Sit," Mrs. Holloway commanded, pointing to a chair at the oak table. "You need meat on those bones." Lena obeyed, too exhausted to protest. Frederick hung his hat on a peg by the door and removed his coat, revealing a lean but muscular frame beneath his simple shirt and suspenders. He washed his hands at a basin in the corner, then joined Lena at the table. Mrs. Holloway placed bowls of steaming stew before them, along with thick slices of bread slathered with fresh butter. "Eat slowly," she advised Lena. "Your stomach's likely shrunk to the size of a walnut." Frederick bowed his head briefly in silent grace before picking up his spoon. Lena followed suit, taking careful, measured bites of the rich stew. The flavors burst across her tongue: tender beef, carrots, potatoes, and herbs. She couldn't identify the most substantial meal she'd had in months. "The room is prepared upstairs, Mrs. Holloway informed Frederick as she bustled about the kitchen. "Fresh linens and towels. I've put water on to heat for a bath." "Thank you, Mrs. Holloway," Frederick said. "I don't know what I'd do without you." The older woman snorted, but Lena caught the fond look she cast in Frederick's direction. "You'd be eating beans from a can and sleeping in a dusty bed, that's what." She turned to Lena. "He works from sunup to sundown, this one. Good with animals and crops, but needs reminding that houses don't clean themselves." Lena smiled, surprised to find her tension easing in the warm kitchen. "I'm accustomed to hard work, Mrs. Holloway. Once I've regained my strength, I'll be able to take over the household duties." "We'll see about that," the older woman replied, but her tone held approval rather than doubt. "First order of business is getting some flesh back on those bones. After the meal, Mrs. Holloway shooed Frederick outside to tend to the horses while she helped Lena upstairs to a modest but clean bedroom. A copper tub had been placed before the small fireplace, steam rising from the water within. "I'll leave you to your bath, Mrs. Holloway said, placing a stack of towels on a nearby chair. "There's a nightgown and robe on the bed belonged to Frederick's mother, but they should fit well enough until we can get you proper clothes." Lena's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. "Thank you, you're very kind, Mrs. Holloway paused at the door, her expression softening. "This is a good house, Miss Blackburn, and Frederick is a good man, better than most." With that cryptic statement, she departed, closing the door firmly behind her. Alone for the first time since her arrival, Lena sank onto the edge of the bed, her legs trembling with exhaustion. The enormity of what she had done traveling halfway across the country to marry a man she'd only known through letters suddenly overwhelmed her. She pressed her hands to her face, fighting back tears of uncertainty and relief that mingled strangely in her chest. The bath revived her spirits somewhat, the hot water soothing muscles stiff from days of travel. She washed her hair with the lavender-scented soap provided, then dressed in the borrowed nightgown. The fine cotton was soft against her skin, though it hung loosely on her diminished frame. She was brushing out her damp hair when a gentle knock sounded at the door. "Miss Blackburn." "May I speak with you a moment?" Frederick's voice came through the wood. Lena hastily donned the robe and cinched it tightly around her waist. "Yes, come in." Frederick entered, carrying her carpet bag. He'd changed into a clean shirt and had clearly washed up after tending to the horses. "I thought you might want this," he said, placing the bag beside the dresser. He remained near the door, carefully maintaining a respectful distance. "Thank you." Lena twisted her hands in the folds of the robe, suddenly acutely aware of the intimacy of being alone in a bedroom with him. Frederick cleared his throat. "I wanted to discuss our arrangement." He shifted his weight, betraying his own nervousness. "I know this isn't a conventional courtship. I've asked you to travel far from everything familiar based on nothing more than letters and promises." "Not nothing, Mr. Nathans," Lena corrected gently. "Your letters were honest. That's more than many offer," he nodded, acknowledging her point. "Even so, I want you to know that I don't expect. That is, I would like us to have time to become better acquainted before we proceed with the marriage." Color rose in his cheeks above his beard. "You'll have this room to yourself. I sleep in the room across the hall." Relief and something like disappointment mingled in Lena's chest. "That seems wise," she managed. Mrs. Holloway will continue to come 3 days a week until you're fully recovered, Frederick continued. I've asked her to take you into town when you feel strong enough to select fabric for new clothes. He hesitated. I hope you don't find me presumptuous, but I've noticed your current garments are, well, you deserve better. The simple kindness, practical yet thoughtful, brought tears to Lena's eyes. She blinked them away, unwilling to appear more fragile than she already had. Thank you, Mr. Nathans. You're very considerate. Frederick's gaze lingered on her face, and for a moment, Lena thought he might step closer. Instead, he moved toward the door. Get some rest. We can talk more in the morning. He paused with his hand on the doorknob. And Miss Blackburn, I meant what I said earlier. You're safe here, and you'll never know hunger again as long as I have anything to say about it. With that, he left, closing the door softly behind him. Lena stood motionless in the center of the room, the weight of his promise settling around her like a blanket. For the first time in 2 years, she allowed herself to feel something dangerously close to hope. The following weeks passed in a haze of recovery and discovery as Lena slowly regained her strength under Mrs. Holloway's watchful eye. The older woman's cooking, hearty, flavorful, and abundant, began to fill out Lena's gaunt frame. The dark circles beneath her eyes faded, and color returned to her cheeks. With her physical recovery came a mental clarity that allowed her to take stock of her new surroundings with growing interest. Frederick maintained a respectful distance, leaving for the fields or the barn before dawn each day and returning for supper in the evenings. Their conversations over meals began tentatively, but grew more comfortable as the days passed. Lena learned that Frederick had fought briefly in the final year of the Civil War, returning home with a slight limp from a bullet that had grazed his right knee. He'd attended 2 years of college in Denver before his father's failing health had called him back to the ranch. He enjoyed reading history books during the winter months when ranch work slowed, and he had a surprisingly rich baritone voice that Lena sometimes heard when he sang to soothe a nervous horse. For his part, Frederick listened attentively as Lena shared stories of her life in Cincinnati, her father's work as a skilled carpenter, her mother's talent for music, the vibrant community they'd been part of before illness and poverty had stripped it all away. She spoke less about the difficult years that followed, but Frederick seemed to understand the shadows that passed over her face when certain memories surfaced. 2 weeks after Lena's arrival, Mrs. Holloway deemed her strong enough for a trip into Shoshone City. Frederick insisted on driving them himself, citing concerns about recent reports of outlaws in the area, though Lena suspected he was simply being protective of her still fragile health. Shoshone City was larger than Lena had initially realized during her brief glimpse upon arrival. Though smaller than Cincinnati, it boasted a main street lined with businesses, a general store, a bank, a hotel, a small restaurant, and various other establishments catering to the needs of ranchers and travelers. Frederick helped the women down from the wagon in front of Mullen's General Store before excusing himself to attend to business at the bank. "I'll meet you ladies back here in 2 hours," he said, tipping his hat. "Mrs. Holloway, please see that Miss Blackburn gets everything she needs." "I know my job, Frederick Nathans," the older woman replied tartly. "Been dressing women a sight longer than you've been alive." Frederick's mouth twitched with amusement as he turned to Lena. "Don't let her bully you into calico if you prefer silk," he said in a stage whisper. Lena smiled, touched by his concern. "I trust Mrs. Holloway's judgment." Inside the store, Lena was overwhelmed by the variety of goods available, far more than she'd expected to find in a frontier town. Mrs. Holloway led her to the fabric section, where bolts of cotton, wool, and even some finer materials were displayed. "Now," the older woman said, running her fingers over a bolt of sturdy cotton, "you'll need at least 3 everyday dresses, a Sunday best, and proper undergarments. Frederick's given me a generous allowance for your needs, so don't fret about the cost." Lena's cheeks warmed at the thought of Frederick considering her undergarments, but she nodded and began examining the fabrics. She selected practical cottons in blues and greens for everyday wear, a lovely lavender wool for cooler weather, and a deep burgundy silk for special occasions. Mrs. Holloway approved her choices, adding selections of ribbon, buttons, and lace to complement each fabric. "You have a good eye," the older woman commented as they moved to examine ready-made items. "Some city women come out west thinking they'll dress as they did back east. Foolishness. Need clothes to work in out here." "I haven't always had fine things," Lena admitted. "Even before our troubles, my family valued practicality over fashion." Mrs. Holloway nodded approvingly. "That'll serve you well as a rancher's wife." She paused, giving Lena a shrewd look. "You are planning to marry him, aren't you? Not stringing the boy along." Lena blinked, startled by the direct question. "Of course, that was our agreement." "Agreements change," Mrs. Holloway said, selecting a pair of sturdy boots in Lena's size. "Seen mail-order brides come out here, take one look at the work involved, and catch the next train east." "I'm not afraid of hard work," Lena replied, a hint of steel entering her voice. "And I honor my commitments." Mrs. Holloway studied her for a long moment before her weathered face creased in a rare smile. "Good. Frederick deserves that much." As they continued shopping, Lena became aware of curious glances directed their way from other customers. A group of women near the fabric counter whispered behind their hands, their eyes darting repeatedly toward Lena. "Pay them no mind," Mrs. Holloway murmured. "Small towns run on gossip." "They've been speculating about Frederick's mail-order bride since the day he first mentioned writing to you, are they?" "Disapproving?" Lena asked hesitantly. "Envious, more like," the older woman snorted. "Frederick Nathans is considered quite a catch in Shoshone City. Several local families have daughters they've been parading before him for years." This revelation surprised Lena. Frederick had never mentioned other romantic prospects in his letters. He never showed interest. "Not since Sarah Miller broke his heart 8 years ago, Mrs. Holloway said, then pressed her lips together as if she'd revealed more than intended. "That's not my story to tell. You should ask him yourself if you're curious." Before Lena could respond, a tall, elegantly dressed woman approached them, her smile not quite reaching her cold blue eyes. "Mrs. Holloway, what a pleasure, and this must be Frederick Nathans's correspondent's bride." The slight pause before correspondence carried clear disdain. Mrs. Holloway's spine stiffened. "Mrs. Preston." "Yes, this is Miss Lena Blackburn. Miss Blackburn, this is Victoria Preston. Her husband owns the bank." "How enterprising of you to travel so far to secure a husband," Mrs. Preston said, her gaze sweeping critically over Lena's borrowed dress. "Though I must say, you're not at all what we expected when Frederick announced he'd sent for a bride from Cincinnati. We imagined someone more substantial." The deliberate cruelty of the remark stung, but Lena had endured far worse than petty social barbs during her years of hardship. She lifted her chin and met Mrs. Preston's gaze directly. "How fortunate that Mr. Nathan seems perfectly satisfied with his choice, then. Your concern is touching, if unnecessary." Mrs. Preston's eyes widened slightly at the calm retort. "Well, I see you have a sharp tongue to compensate for your other deficiencies. I do hope Frederick knows what he's getting." "He's getting exactly what he deserves," Mrs. Holloway cut in, her voice like ice. "A woman of character and courage. Now, if you'll excuse us, Mrs. Preston, we have purchases to complete." The banker's wife pursed her lips but retreated with a rustle of expensive silk. Mrs. Holloway watched her go with undisguised contempt. "Victoria Preston's daughter Amelia has had her cap set for Frederick since she turned 16. The girl is 19 now and still thinks Frederick will suddenly forget she exists only for her father's money." Lena absorbed this information silently, filing it away with other pieces of the puzzle that was Frederick Nathans. The encounter had left her feeling oddly protective of the man who was, technically, still a stranger to her in many ways. They completed their shopping, arranging for the fabrics to be delivered to the ranch once Mrs. Holloway had sewn them into garments. Lena did insist on wearing one new ready-made dress back to the ranch, a simple blue cotton that fit her far better than Mrs. Nathans's borrowed clothes. Frederick was waiting for them outside the general store, deep in conversation with a man in a sheriff's badge. He looked up as they approached, his expression brightening visibly at the sight of Lena in her new dress. The simple reaction warmed her more than she cared to admit. "You look well, Miss Blackburn," he said, his voice carrying a hint of something deeper than mere politeness. "Thank you, Mr. Nathans," Lena replied, suddenly shy under his appreciative gaze. Frederick turned to introduce the man beside him. "This is Sheriff Lawson. Sheriff, my fiancée, Miss Lena Blackburn." The sheriff tipped his hat. "Madam, welcome to Wyoming territory. You're a brave woman to come out here on your own. Or desperate," Lena said with a small smile to soften the truth of her words. "Though I'm finding there's much to recommend Shoshone City." Sheriff Lawson chuckled. "Well, we're glad to have you. The territory needs good women willing to put down roots." He turned serious as he addressed Frederick again. "Remember what I said about those Chambers boys. They've been spotted near Johnson Creek. Might be nothing, but keep your rifle handy." Frederick nodded grimly. "I appreciate the warning, Sheriff." He helped Lena and Mrs. Holloway onto the wagon, his movements betraying tension that hadn't been present earlier. As they drove out of town, Lena couldn't help asking, "Who are the Chambers boys?" Frederick's jaw tightened. "Cattle rustlers and worse. Been causing trouble throughout the territory for about a year now. Sheriff thinks they might be using the caves near Johnson Creek as a hideout." "Are we in danger?" Lena asked, thinking of the creek Frederick had pointed out on their first journey to the ranch. "Not likely," he assured her, though his hand rested closer to the rifle secured beneath the wagon seat than it had on their trip into town. "They typically avoid established ranches. Too much risk of resistance. They prefer to hit the smaller spreads or rustling from grazing herds." The knowledge that there were outlaws potentially camped at the edge of Frederick's property cast a shadow over the remainder of the journey. When they arrived back at the ranch, Frederick insisted on escorting both women inside before tending to the horses and wagon. That evening after supper, Mrs. Holloway departed for her small house in town, leaving Lena and Frederick alone for the first time since her arrival. They sat in companionable silence before the hearth, Lena working on mending one of Frederick's shirts while he cleaned his rifle, the rhythmic movements of his hands oddly hypnotic in the firelight. "Mrs. Holloway mentioned someone named Sarah Miller today," Lena said finally, the question that had been burning in her mind all afternoon finally finding voice. Frederick's hands stilled on the rifle. He didn't look up, but Lena could see the sudden tension in his shoulders. "Did she now?" "She didn't elaborate," Lena hastened to add. "She said it wasn't her story to tell." Frederick was silent for so long that Lena thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. "Sarah Miller was the daughter of our nearest neighbors when I was growing up. We were childhood friends. Later we were more than friends." He set the rifle aside and stared into the fire. "We were engaged to be married when I went to fight in '64. I was only gone 8 months, but when I came back, she was married to a banker from Cheyenne." Lena's needle paused mid-stitch. "I'm sorry." Frederick shrugged, the gesture failing to convey the indifference he clearly intended. "It was a long time ago. Her husband had money, prospects. All I had was a ranch that might or might not survive the next drought." He looked up then, meeting Lena's gaze directly. "I don't hold it against her. She made the practical choice." "Not all women value practicality over love," Lena said softly. Something flickered in Frederick's eyes. "Is that why you agreed to come west, Miss Blackburn? For love?" The directness of the question caught Lena off guard. She considered her answer carefully. "I came for survival, Mr. Nathans. I won't pretend otherwise." She set her mending aside and folded her hands in her lap. "But I believe love can grow from respect and shared purpose. My parents didn't love each other when they married. That came later with time and understanding." Frederick nodded slowly. "That's a sensible approach." He picked up his rifle again, resuming his cleaning with methodical precision. "May I ask you something personal, Miss Blackburn? of course. Your letters never mention the extent of your hardship. His voice was gentle but direct. Why didn't you tell me how desperate your situation had become? Lena felt heat rise to her cheeks. Would you have wanted a half-starved seamstress with nothing to her name if I had been honest about my circumstances? Frederick's gaze snapped up to meet hers, surprise evident in his expression. Do you think me so shallow? Not shallow, Lena corrected. Practical, like Sarah Miller. Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed quickly by something that looked remarkably like hurt. I'm not looking for a ornament, Miss Blackburn. I need a partner. Someone strong enough to weather the hardships of ranch life. Your current condition speaks to your resilience, not your weakness. The sincerity in his voice touched something deep within Lena. I apologize for misjudging you. Frederick shook his head. No need, we're still learning each other's measure. He set the cleaned rifle aside and stood, stretching slightly. It's getting late, we should both get some rest. As they climbed the stairs to their separate bedrooms, Lena found herself studying Frederick's profile in the dim light of the oil lamp he carried. The strong line of his jaw, the slight furrow between his brows, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, all details that were becoming increasingly familiar, and if she were honest with herself, increasingly dear to her. At her door, Frederick paused. Good night, Miss Blackburn. I'm glad you're here. The simple statement, spoken without artifice or expectation, warmed Lena more than any flowery declaration could have. As am I, Mr. Nathans. Good night. The following days settled into a comfortable rhythm. With her strength returning, Lena began taking on more household duties, initially working alongside Mrs. Holloway and gradually assuming tasks on her own. She learned to cook on the large cast iron stove, mastering the art of maintaining a consistent temperature for baking bread and simmering stews. She discovered Frederick's preference for apple pie over all other desserts and took special care to perfect her crust. When Mrs. Holloway brought a basket of late-season apples from her own small orchard in town, Frederick, for his part, began including Lena in more aspects of ranch life. He showed her the spring house where milk and butter were kept cool, taught her how to collect eggs without agitating the hens, and introduced her to each of the horses in the stable by name. Lena absorbed these lessons eagerly, determined to prove herself a worthy partner in the life Frederick was offering her. Their planned wedding date 3 months after Lena's arrival loomed closer with each passing day. Though they maintained separate bedrooms and proper decorum, something undeniable was growing between them. Lena caught Frederick watching her when he thought she wouldn't notice, his eyes warm with an emotion she dared not name. She found herself listening for his footsteps at the end of each day, her heart beating a little faster when he entered the house for supper. 6 weeks after Lena's arrival, the first significant storm of the season blew in from the mountains. Frederick had departed before dawn to check on a pregnant heifer in the far pasture, promising to return before the worst of the weather hit. But as morning gave way to afternoon and the sky darkened to an ominous slate gray, Lena's concern grew. By mid-afternoon, snow was falling heavily, driven sideways by a bitter wind that howled around the corners of the house. Lena paced from window to window, straining to see through the thickening white curtain for any sign of Frederick. When the light began to fade without his return, she made a decision that Mrs. Holloway, who had stayed over due to the approaching storm, vocally opposed. You can't go out in this. The older woman protested as Lena pulled on a heavy coat that had belonged to Frederick's mother. You'll freeze to death before you find him. He should have been back hours ago, Lena argued, wrapping a woolen scarf around her neck and lower face. Something's wrong, I know it. Then I'll go, Mrs. Holloway insisted. I've lived in Wyoming for 40 years, I know these blizzards. And you're 65 years old, Lena countered gently but firmly. I'm young and strong now, thanks to your care. Besides, I know which pasture he went to check. He showed me last week. Mrs. Holloway's weathered face creased with worry. At least take the lantern and matches and a rope. Tie one end to the porch post so you can find your way back if the snow gets too thick." Lena nodded, grateful for the practical advice. She gathered the suggested items, along with a flask of hot coffee and an extra blanket, then steeled herself for the biting cold outside. The moment she stepped off the porch, the full force of the storm hit her. Snow stung her exposed skin like tiny needles, and the wind threatened to knock her off her feet. Keeping one hand on the rope secured to the porch post, Lena pushed forward toward the barn. She would need a horse if she had any hope of finding Frederick before nightfall made the search impossible. Inside the barn, the animals were restless, sensing the storm's violence. Lena approached Thunder, Frederick's most reliable gelding, speaking soothingly as she slipped a bridle over his head. There was no time for a saddle, and in truth, Lena was not confident in her ability to secure one properly. She would have to ride bareback. Leading Thunder to the barn door, Lena hesitated, suddenly struck by the foolishness of her plan. The storm had intensified even in the few minutes she'd spent in the barn. Visibility was down to mere feet, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. To venture out now was to risk not only her life but Thunder's as well. As she stood wavering, a shadow appeared through the swirling snow, a large, dark shape moving slowly toward the barn. Lena's heart leaped into her throat. "Frederick," she called, her voice whipped away by the wind. The shadow resolved into Frederick astride his mare, Duchess. Both horse and rider were covered in snow, and Frederick was slumped forward in a way that sent fear coursing through Lena's veins. She rushed forward, reaching for Duchess's bridle as the exhausted animal staggered into the relative shelter of the barn. "Thank God," Frederick murmured, his voice weak. "Made it. Frederick, are you hurt?" Lena reached up to help him dismount, alarmed by the pallor of his face and the unfocused look in his eyes. "Not hurt," he managed as he half fell from the saddle into her waiting arms. "Just cold, so cold." Lena struggled under his weight, but managed to guide him to a pile of clean straw near the back of the barn. Frederick's clothes were soaked through with melting snow, and his lips had a bluish tinge that terrified her. Hypothermia, she'd seen it once in Cincinnati during a particularly brutal winter when a homeless man had been brought into her church for shelter. He had died despite their efforts to warm him. "We need to get you out of these wet clothes," she said, her fear making her voice sharper than intended. She began tugging at his coat, her fingers clumsy with cold and haste. Frederick tried to help, but his movements were sluggish, his coordination clearly impaired by the cold. Lena worked quickly, stripping away his sodden outer layers and wrapping the blanket she'd brought around his shoulders. His skin was alarmingly cold to the touch, and he shivered violently as she rubbed his arms through the blanket, trying to generate warmth. "Here," she said, uncapping the flask of coffee and holding it to his lips. "Drink this. It's still hot." Frederick obeyed, sipping slowly as Lena continued her efforts to warm him. The barn, though far from warm, at least provided shelter from the wind and snow. The animal's body heat raised the temperature slightly above the frigid outdoors, but it wasn't enough. Lena knew they needed to get Frederick to the house, to the fire that Mrs. Holloway would be stoking to blazing intensity. "Can you stand?" she asked when some color had returned to his face. "We need to get you inside." Frederick nodded weakly and attempted to rise, but his legs buckled beneath him. Lena caught him before he could fall, alarmed by his continued weakness. "I'm sorry," he mumbled. "Just need a moment." Lena made a quick decision. "Stay here, I'll go get help." She made sure he was securely wrapped in the blanket and pressed the flask into his hands. "Keep drinking the coffee, I'll be back as quickly as I can." She started toward the barn door, but Frederick's voice stopped her. "Lena, wait." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the intimacy of it froze her in place. "The rope, from the house, is it still there?" Lena's hand flew to her mouth. In her rush to reach Frederick, she had dropped the end of the rope she'd been holding. With the snow falling as heavily as it was, the rope would be buried, impossible to find in the gathering darkness. "I didn't." She began, horror washing over her. "It's all right," Frederick said, his voice stronger now. "We'll shelter here tonight, too dangerous to try finding the house now." The prospect of spending the night in the barn, away from the comfort and warmth of the house, was daunting. But Frederick was right. Attempting to navigate the few hundred yards to the house in a blinding snowstorm without a guide rope was a fool's errand. "Mrs. Holloway will be worried sick," Lena fretted. "She's a smart woman," Frederick replied. "She'll know we're in the barn. First place she'll look when the storm breaks." He shifted, making room for Lena beside him on the straw. "Come here, we need to share body heat." Lena hesitated, acutely aware of the impropriety of the situation. But survival trumped propriety, and Frederick's continued shivering concerned her deeply. She settled beside him, allowing him to wrap part of the blanket around her shoulders so that they were cocooned together in its warmth. "I'm sorry," Frederick murmured as Lena's body gradually relaxed against his. "Should have started back earlier, saw the storm coming but thought I had time." "What happened?" Lena asked, partly to keep him talking, partly to distract herself from the intimacy of their position. "Heifer had her calf, early but both doing well, was heading back when the storm hit full force. Duchess lost the trail." He shook his head slightly. "Good horse. She found her way home somehow." They fell silent, listening to the howl of the wind outside and the occasional shifting of the animals in their stalls. Despite the cold and discomfort, Lena found herself hyper-aware of Frederick's proximity, the solid warmth of his chest against her back, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the clean scent of him beneath the lingering dampness of his clothes. "You came looking for me," Frederick said after a long pause, his voice rumbling through his chest into her back. "Of course I did," Lena replied simply. "You were missing." His arm tightened around her waist. "It was dangerous. You could have been lost in the storm." Lena turned slightly to look at him over her shoulder. "Would you not have done the same for me?" Frederick's eyes, now clear and focused, met hers, without hesitation. Something shifted between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing steadily beneath the surface of their practical arrangement. Lena found herself studying Frederick's face with new awareness, the strength in his jawline, the kindness in his eyes, the slight curl of his hair where it fell across his forehead. "Frederick," she whispered, his name still unfamiliar on her tongue. He reached up to brush a strand of hair from her cheek, his touch gentle despite the roughness of his calloused fingers. "Lena." The sound of her name in his deep voice sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. Frederick misinterpreted her reaction, pulling the blanket more securely around them. "Try to sleep," he suggested. "The storm will likely pass by morning." Lena nodded, though sleep seemed an impossible prospect with her heart racing and her mind whirling. She closed her eyes nonetheless, allowing the steady rhythm of Frederick's heartbeat to lull her into a state of calm if not actual slumber. The night passed slowly, broken by periods of restless sleep and wakeful moments when the storm's fury seemed to intensify. Frederick remained vigilant, tending the lantern and occasionally checking on the horses. By dawn, the wind had died down, though snow continued to fall steadily. "We should try for the house," Frederick said, peering out the small window near the barn door. "The worst has passed." They emerged into a transformed landscape. Snow blanketed everything in pristine white, drifting against the barn in smooth curves that reached nearly to the roof in places. The house was barely visible through the continuing snowfall, but a plume of smoke from the chimney confirmed that Mrs. Holloway had kept the fire burning through the night. Frederick took Lena's hand firmly in his as they began trudging through the knee-deep snow toward the house. The simple contact felt natural now, as if some invisible barrier had dissolved during their night in the barn. Mrs. Holloway flung the door open before they reached the porch, her face lined with worry that quickly gave way to relief. "Thank the Lord," she exclaimed. "I've been sick with worry all night." She ushered them inside, clucking like a mother hen as she helped them out of their snow-covered garments. The warmth of the house enveloped them, almost painful after the prolonged exposure to cold. Into dry clothes, both of you, Mrs. Holloway ordered. Then breakfast. I've kept the porridge warm and there's fresh coffee. As Lena turned toward the stairs, Frederick caught her hand again, stopping her. Before Mrs. Holloway or Lena could react, he leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to Lena's forehead. "Thank you," he said simply, "for coming to find me," the gesture, witnessed by a visibly startled Mrs. Holloway, marked another turning point in their relationship. Over the following days, small changes manifested Frederick's hand at the small of Lena's back as he guided her through a doorway. Lena's fingers lingering on his as she passed him a cup of coffee, their conversations extending later into the evenings as they sat before the fire. 2 weeks after the snowstorm, Frederick approached Lena as she was gathering eggs in the henhouse, his expression uncharacteristically nervous. "I have a question for you," he said, his hands fidgeting with the brim of his hat. Lena set down her basket of eggs and gave him her full attention. "Yes, our arrangement, the wedding date we agreed upon." He cleared his throat. "Would you object to moving it forward?" Lena's heart skipped a beat. "Forward to when?" "Next Sunday." The question emerged almost as a plea, and a faint flush colored Frederick's cheeks above his beard. "That is, if you're willing. If you need more time, I understand completely. It's just that—" "Yes," Lena interrupted his rambling, a smile spreading across her face. "Next Sunday would be perfect." Frederick's expression brightened with such evident joy that Lena couldn't help but laugh. He stepped forward, hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. Gently, he cupped her face in his hands and lowered his mouth to hers in a kiss that was both tender and reverent. Lena had been kissed before awkward, fumbling exchanges with boys in Cincinnati that had left her wondering what the fuss was about. This was different. Frederick's kiss spoke of respect and growing affection, of promises kept and promises yet to be made. When he finally pulled away, his eyes searched hers with a question he didn't voice. "I came west for survival," Lena said softly, echoing her words from weeks before. "But I think I may have found much more than that." Frederick's smile was answer enough. The news of their accelerated wedding plans was met with enthusiastic approval from Mrs. Holloway, who immediately set about preparing Lena's wedding dress from the burgundy silk they had purchased in town. The dress, when finished, was a marvel of simplicity and elegance, with a fitted bodice and modest bustle that flattered Lena's now healthier figure. Word spread quickly through Shoshone City, as news inevitably did in small frontier communities. On the Sunday of the wedding, the small church was filled beyond capacity with ranchers, townspeople, and curious onlookers. Lena recognized few of the faces, but the genuine warmth in their greetings suggested that Frederick was well respected in the community. Victoria Preston was conspicuously absent, though her husband attended alone, offering stiff congratulations after the ceremony. Mrs. Holloway, resplendent in her Sunday best, served as Lena's witness and made no effort to hide the tears that streamed down her weathered cheeks as Frederick and Lena exchanged their vows. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful, the frontier preacher's words resonating with practical wisdom about partnership and perseverance. When Frederick slipped a simple gold band onto Lena's finger, a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, he later told her she felt a sense of belonging that had eluded her since her parents' deaths. The celebration afterward was held at the ranch, with neighbors bringing dishes to share in the frontier tradition of community support. Lena moved among the guests, now Frederick's wife in truth as well as name, accepting congratulations and good wishes with growing confidence. This was her home now, these people her community. As the party wound down and the last guests departed, Frederick found Lena standing on the porch, watching the sunset paint the snow-covered landscape in hues of pink and gold. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against his chest, reveling in the simple rightness of the moment. "Happy, Mrs. Nathans?" he asked, his breath warm against her ear. Lena smiled at the new name, still unfamiliar but increasingly precious. "Very," she replied honestly. Are you? More than I thought possible. His arms tightened around her. When I sent that letter to the matrimonial agency, I hoped for a practical arrangement, a partnership based on mutual need and respect. He turned her gently to face him. I never expected to feel this way. And how do you feel? Lena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Frederick studied her face, his expression serious. Like a man who has been given a second chance at happiness. Like a man who wants to spend every day making sure his wife never regrets her decision to travel west to a stranger. Not a stranger anymore, Lena corrected, reaching up to touch his face. My husband. Later that night, as they lay in what was now their shared bedroom, Lena traced lazy patterns on Frederick's chest, her mind drifting over the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. From the depths of poverty and desperation in Cincinnati to the warm security of Frederick's arms in Wyoming, it seemed almost like a dream. What are you thinking? Frederick asked, his fingers combing gently through her loose hair. That I was starving in more ways than one when I arrived, Lena replied truthfully. And that you've kept your promise. I'll never go hungry again for food or for love. Frederick's arms tightened around her. That's a promise I'll renew every day for the rest of our lives. As winter gave way to spring, Lena settled fully into her role as Mrs. Frederick Nathans. The ranch thrived under their combined care, Frederick managing the cattle and crops with the help of 2 hired hands, Lena overseeing the household and expanding the kitchen garden into a productive plot that supplied much of their produce needs. Mrs. Holloway continued to visit regularly, though her role had evolved from caretaker to friend and mentor, as Lena gained confidence in her abilities. Spring brought the birth of new calves and foals, and Lena discovered a natural affinity for midwifing the animals through difficult deliveries. Her steady hands and calm demeanor proved valuable during a particularly complicated foaling, earning her Frederick's admiration and the grudging respect of the ranch hands who had initially been skeptical of the city woman. Summer arrived with its intense heat and long days of endless work. Lena learned to preserve the garden's bounty for the winter ahead, filling the cellar with jars of vegetables and fruits. She took pride in keeping Frederick and the hands well fed, her cooking skills improving until even Mrs. Holloway admitted that Lena's apple pie rivaled her own. The busy days were balanced by peaceful evenings spent on the porch, watching the sunset and planning for the future. Frederick spoke of expanding the herd, perhaps purchasing additional acreage from a neighboring ranch whose owner was considering a move to California. Lena shared her ideas for improvements to the house, a larger kitchen, perhaps, or a proper guest room for when Mrs. Holloway stayed over during bad weather. In late August, as the wheat was being harvested, Lena made a discovery that would change their lives forever. She had been feeling unusually tired for several weeks, with occasional bouts of nausea in the mornings. Mrs. Holloway, visiting to help with canning tomatoes, had observed Lena's symptoms with knowing eyes. When did you last have your monthly courses? The older woman asked bluntly as they worked side by side in the kitchen. Lena paused, a tomato half peeled in her hand as she mentally calculated. Not since June, I think. The realization dawned slowly, followed by a rush of excitement and fear. Do you think, Mrs. Holloway smiled, patting Lena's hand. I'd say you'll be welcoming a little Nathans come spring. That evening, Lena waited until they were alone in their bedroom to share the news with Frederick. His reaction, speechless joy, followed by a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes, confirmed what she already knew. The child would be welcomed with abundant love. As her body changed to accommodate the growing life within, Frederick became even more protective, insisting that she rest frequently and hiring a local girl to help with the heavier household chores. Lena tolerated his fussing with good humor, though she drew the line when he suggested she might be more comfortable sleeping alone until after the birth. I married you for better or worse, she reminded him firmly. This is decidedly better, and I want you beside me every night. The winter of 1877 proved milder than the previous year, a blessing for which Lena was grateful as her pregnancy progressed. By February, she felt the first fluttering movements of the baby, a sensation she described to Frederick as like butterfly wings inside me. He spent long moments with his hand pressed gently against her rounded belly, his expression one of wonder when he felt their child kick for the first time. In early May, just as the first wildflowers were beginning to bloom across the Wyoming landscape, Lena went into labor. Mrs. Holloway and the local midwife attended her through 14 hours of increasingly intense contractions. Frederick paced the hallway outside their bedroom, his face drawn with worry as Lena's cries grew more frequent. "Go check on your husband before he wears a hole in the floorboards," Lena gasped to Mrs. Holloway between contractions. "Tell him I'm fine." Mrs. Holloway complied, returning moments later with a grim expression. "That man is as white as my best flower. Says he'd rather face a grizzly bear than hear you in such pain and not be able to help." Lena managed a weak smile before another contraction gripped her. "Tell him, this is nothing compared to starving." Finally, as dawn was breaking over the eastern horizon, William Frederick Nathans made his entrance into the world with a lusty cry that brought his father running. The midwife barely had time to wrap the infant in a clean blanket before Frederick burst through the door, his expression transforming from anxiety to awe at the sight of Lena holding their son. "A boy," Lena said softly, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten as she gazed at the tiny, perfect face. "8 fingers and 2 thumbs, just as it should be." Frederick approached the bed cautiously, as if afraid that sudden movements might somehow shatter the miracle before him. "He's beautiful," he whispered, gently touching his son's downy head, "just like his mother, Mrs. Holloway." And the midwife discreetly withdrew, leaving the new family alone for these precious first moments together. Frederick settled carefully on the edge of the bed, his arm around Lena's shoulders as they both marveled at their creation. "I never thought I could be this happy," Frederick confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "When you stepped off that train a year and a half ago, so thin and frightened, all I wanted was to make you feel safe. I never imagined how completely you would transform my life." Lena leaned against him, their son cradled between them. "You promised I would never go hungry again," she reminded him. "But you've given me so much more than food and shelter. You've given me a home, a family, a purpose." She looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears and love. "You've given me everything." As little William grew from infant to toddler, the Nathans ranch prospered. Frederick's careful management and willingness to adopt new farming techniques resulted in increased yields and a growing reputation for quality stock. Lena's contribution was equally significant. Her meticulous record-keeping and natural business acumen helped transform what had been a subsistence operation into a profitable enterprise. By the time William was 3, Lena was expecting their second child. The announcement coincided with another significant development. Frederick had been approached by a representative of the railroad about selling part of their land for a spur line that would connect Shoshone City more directly to the main east-west route. The offer was generous, and the potential benefits to both the ranch and the community were substantial. "What do you think?" Frederick asked Lena as they discussed the proposal late one night after William was asleep. "It would mean giving up the north pasture, but the payment would allow us to purchase the Wilkins property to the east." Lena considered the map spread before them on the kitchen table. "The Wilkins land has better water access," she observed. "And being connected directly to the railroad would reduce our shipping costs significantly." Frederick nodded, watching her with pride as she analyzed the business aspects of the decision. "My practical wife, always thinking ahead." Lena smiled, resting a hand on her gently rounded belly. "Someone has to. You're too busy daydreaming about whether this one will be another boy or perhaps a girl with her father's eyes." "Guilty as charged," Frederick admitted with a grin. though I'm equally interested in the business advantages of the railroad connection." They decided to accept the offer, and construction on the spur line began that summer. The work brought an influx of laborers to the area, increasing business for Shoshone City's merchants and bringing new opportunities for the ranch. Frederick contracted to supply beef for the workers' mess, while Lena found a ready market for butter, eggs, and baked goods among the railroad families who had set up temporary housing near the construction site. In November, Elizabeth Rose Nathans arrived during the first snowfall of the season. Unlike her brother's dramatic entry, Elizabeth's birth was relatively quick and straightforward, with Frederick present throughout at Lena's insistence. William, now old enough to understand that he was a big brother, approached his tiny sister with solemn curiosity, declaring after careful inspection that she was small but good. The years that followed brought both challenges and rewards. A severe drought in 1882 tested their resilience, but the reservoir Frederick had constructed based on Lena's suggestion ensured that their crops survived when others withered. An outbreak of hoof and mouth disease among cattle in the region the following year threatened their herd, but Frederick's prompt quarantine measures prevented widespread losses. Through it all, the partnership that had begun as a practical arrangement deepened into an unbreakable bond. They weathered each crisis together, Frederick's steady strength complementing Lena's resourceful intelligence. Their children thrived in the loving environment they created, William growing into a thoughtful boy with his mother's quick mind and his father's love of the land, Elizabeth developing a spirited independence that both delighted and occasionally exasperated her parents. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Frederick surprised Lena with a gift that brought tears to her eyes: a small, bound journal containing copies of their original correspondence. "You kept all my letters?" Lena asked, turning the pages reverently. "Every one," Frederick confirmed. "They're what brought you to me. How could I not treasure them?" Lena touched the faded ink, marveling at the formal, careful language they had used, two strangers negotiating a life together with no guarantee of success. "We were so cautious," she murmured. "So careful not to promise more than we could deliver." Frederick sat beside her on the porch swing, his arms settling comfortably around her shoulders. "And yet look at all we've built together." Lena leaned against him, watching their children playing in the yard with the puppies born to their aging sheepdog the previous month. The ranch house had expanded over the years: a larger kitchen, 2 additional bedrooms, a proper study where Frederick and Lena managed the increasingly complex business of the ranch. Beyond the house, new barns and outbuildings dotted the property, and fields of wheat and corn stretched toward the horizon. "Do you ever regret it?" Lena asked suddenly. "Taking a chance on a half-starved mail-order bride with nothing to offer but a willingness to work hard?" Frederick turned to look at her, his expression serious. Not for a single moment. He brushed a strand of hair now threaded with occasional silver from her face. "Best decision I ever made, even better than the north pasture for the railroad deal," Lena teased. "Much better," Frederick assured her, his eyes crinkling at the corners in the way that still made her heart skip a beat. "That only made us prosperous. You, Lena Nathans, made me happy." As twilight settled over Nathan's ranch, Frederick and Lena remained on the porch, their hands intertwined, watching their children and the life they had built together. From desperate beginnings had come abundance beyond measure, not just in material wealth, but in the richness of family, community, and love that sustained them through each season. Lena thought back to that first day at the train station in Shoshone City, when a stranger had looked at her with compassion rather than pity and promised that she would never go hungry again. Frederick had kept that promise in every way that mattered, nourishing not just her body but her spirit, her dreams, her capacity for joy. "I love you," she said simply, the words carrying the weight of their shared history and the promise of their future. Frederick's hand tightened around hers. "And I love you, more with each passing day." As the first stars appeared in the Wyoming sky, Lena Nathans counted her blessings: a loving husband, healthy children, a prosperous ranch, a community that had embraced her as one of their own. From the deepest hunger, she had found the fullest satisfaction. From desperate need had come abundant joy. The journey from mail-order bride to beloved wife and mother had not always been easy, but Lena wouldn't have changed a single step of the path that had led her home.